Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone, and the Libertarian Institute. Today, I am joined by Danny Duchamp of DannyDuchamp.com. Check out his excellent video, Why I'm an ANCAP. Danny, where is the best place to find your Substack and collection of work?
So if you want to see all my stuff, that is at DannyDuchamp.com. But if you want to go direct to the Substack, it's just DannyDuchamp.substack.com.
Today, we are going over the book Hidden Order, The Economics of Everyday Life by David Friedman. Friedman says, we start with a single assumption, rationality, and with it, we set out to conquer the world. He then defines rationality as an assumption about individual behavior, not group behavior. What do we need to understand about what his rationality point is here?
Yeah, so that's something that differs between different schools of economics a little bit, but the neoclassical one, the mainstream one, or the Chicago one, which is the school David's from, it's about behavior as opposed to what's inside your head. We're not just saying that a rational person is someone who uses means to achieve ends. You might hear, like Austrian economists, for example, they'll talk about how someone doing a rain dance is acting rationally because he's using means to achieve ends, whether or not those means are successful in achieving those ends. But the definition of rationality that he uses is that it's when you take an action that successfully achieves your ends. Now, when you say it's about individual behavior as opposed to group behavior, that's because the assumption about group behavior doesn't work quite as well. So if you make an assumption that individuals act rationally, that there's a lot of reasons that can actually make sense. Because individuals do successfully clothe and feed themselves and do all of the basic things that satisfy their values, that satisfy their objectives. They don't do it perfectly, but it's a reasonable approximation, right? Whereas groups have necessarily less rationality than an individual. So if you are in a group of people, then the individuals can be perfectly rational, but the group that they're in may still behave irrationally. So even if the individual members of a group are rational, all their actions may sum together into something irrational, which was where you get like prisoner's dilemma style situations and things like that, which I think we'll touch on a little bit later.
He says economics is that way of understanding behavior that starts from the assumption that individuals have objectives and tend to choose the correct way to achieve them. Does that assume that people are generally intelligent? What is he assuming there?
Right. Yeah, it's not assuming that people are particularly intelligent. Intelligence is a relative scale anyway. I'm intelligent compared to someone dumber than me, but dumb compared to someone smarter than me. So all it assumes is that people have some method of achieving their objectives. A baby crying is using some means to achieve his ends successfully. He wants some food, he cries, he gets the food. He didn't logically think it through. He didn't think, my parent has a value scale, and at the top of that value scale, or somewhere near it, is me not crying. So if I start crying, then they will give me this food. The baby didn't think through all that. There's no calculation necessarily involved. It's just that assuming that the baby has an objective to get food, and why is it crying? Well, because it's going to successfully achieve that objective is a useful rubric for understanding human behavior.
The reason this definition is so important is because it sort of answers the objection that economics is astrology for people who think they're extra intelligent. When you look at GDP numbers and unemployment numbers, and those people on CNBC talking about all that stuff are totally unable to predict future crashes or explain why some countries are wealthy and others are impoverished. Well, if you think economics is about numbers as opposed to human beings acting with ends that they'd like to achieve, well, no wonder it's going to look like absolute witchcraft. So we have this definition and then a competing definition from another Chicago graduate, Thomas Sowell, who says economics is the study of the use of scarce resources that have alternative uses. When it comes to these two competing definitions, do you think they're complementary, or do you pick one over the other?
Both. I think that one is preferable. I think that David Friedman's approach of focusing on the fact that ultimately economics is dealing with the actions of individuals. I think that is a lot more useful. However, the two definitions aren't actually in conflict. So scarce resources that have alternative uses, right? To study those, you aren't necessarily studying human actions. A scarce resource isn't just one that there isn't infinity of, right? Isn't just one that there is very little of, right? As we usually use the term, we say something's scarce because there's not very much of it. It just means there isn't infinity of it. So when you say that there isn't infinity of something, it's not providing all of the good it currently could be providing, then the only reason that that's the only reason that you'd take some action to change the state of affairs. So when I pick up a piece of fruit and eat it, that's because there is a scarce resource, which is the enjoyment of that fruit or the satiation of my hunger. It's ultimately because there's something that I don't have. It doesn't matter how many pieces of fruit there are, I'm still taking an action because there is something that is scarce that I don't have enough of that I want.
That, again, is so important because it's not like you need a stock market to understand economics. Robinson Crusoe, alone on the island, is economizing. He's using his scarce time. He doesn't sleep 24 hours a day, nor does he work 24 hours a day. He attempts to economize and find an equilibrium. So when it comes to what he discusses on page 17, he talks about the principle of revealed choice preference. What is revealed choice preference?
That's just looking at someone's behavior and explaining it by virtue of the assumption that it's fulfilling the values that that person has. If you look at someone's behavior and you don't assume revealed preference, basically the only other alternative is that it's sort of like random or something like that. We usually look at someone doing something and think about him doing that in terms of the things that he wants to achieve. Right? We look at someone who's hammering in a nail. They probably want to build a house or something like that. That's all that it is. But it's a really useful thing to think about, because whenever you're trying to understand this complex world of humans interacting, you're not going to model every individual's brain perfectly and figure out causally exactly how all these individuals will interact. The only way you can hope to understand it is the way we normally do, right? You look at someone doing something, you assume, well, he's probably trying to achieve some goal.
And the reason this, what appears to be a very simple, almost boring observation, it matters because he says, we do not usually make people better off by reducing their alternatives. What does he mean by that?
So this is usually used in situations where someone might be advocating against some free market interaction. So a common example would be sweatshops in the third world. There's these multinational companies that will go over to the third world and build a factory there and hire some people at what, to us, very low wages. Advocacy against this, saying that the sweatshop owner or the company owner should not be allowed to do this, is looking at a group of people, looking at the option that they actually chose, as opposed to all the other options that they chose, because those people could have worked as subsistence farmers as they were before the company came there, or maybe for some local firm. But this new company coming there and providing them that opportunity, that was the one they actually chose, which means it's ranked more highly than the others. So when you advocate against that, you say that the company shouldn't be able to go and set up this so-called sweatshop, or this company that this factory that just pays less than we think that it ought to. What you're doing is you're taking a look at these people, seeing the option they actually chose and taking that one away, right? It's removing the one that they think is the best option, therefore necessarily leaving them with worse ones.
Yeah, it's just as arrogant as, those old families who would not let people marry who they wanted to. The families would forcibly stop kids from getting married, and it was very tyrannical and oppressive. Well, you doing that with someone's career is actually no different. You're really cutting the ladder that they're using to climb as well. It's absolutely unbelievable, the hubris that they have. It's like, it's hard enough to know what's best for you, let alone your kids or your neighbors, but millions of strangers. I mean, where is this level of humility coming from?
Well, the way I always like to describe it is advocating against a company providing jobs in third world countries is like looking at a man walking on a crutch and saying, look, how sad is it that that guy has to walk on a crutch? Let's take away his crutch. Right? That's what it is. It's not a great option, but it's the best option he has. So taking it away makes him worse off. The lack of humility that results in that, it might just come from a lack of thinking things through properly. I mean, people in a political system, a democratic one, or pretty much any political system really aren't incentivized to think things through rationally. They're just incentivized to pick whichever option sounds best when you don't think about it too much. And the reason, of course, is that when I vote for something or I take some political action to achieve a political goal, I have a tiny, negligible effect on whether that actually happens. So I don't have to worry about whether it's really going to work out well. The only thing that I actually get from my action is the feeling that I have had some positive effect. But that doesn't matter if it really works out, right? In that case, it doesn't matter if it really works out. It just matters if it sounded good to me at the time. So if I don't think about it too much, then I will get something that sounds really good to me. So I'm incentivized not to think about it very much.
And there's just this amazing approach that people have where they will not look at the costs of anything. They'll say, this or that should be free, as if there are no secondary consequences, as if the state paying for it also means it's free. It's as ridiculous as saying the military is free. So when they say, well, wages should be higher, that's just them putting blind obligations on total strangers in situations they have no information about. I like how you confidently address these people when you said billionaires and mega corporations are good, actually. Using the insights you learned from Hidden Order, the economics of everyday life, how could you defend such a statement?
Okay, so the main thing that people criticize is simply that these organizations or these individuals have so much, and it's obscene. They've amassed too much wealth. That's simply ignoring how they got it, which in the case that they are actually billionaires from interacting in the market, like they've sold some products or they've built some service, whether that's through the corporation or as an individual, if they've amassed that amount of money, that means they can only do so by providing things to other people that those other people value even more than that money. So the billionaires and mega corporations have gotten so big and so wealthy simply by providing people with goods and services that they value more than that money. In fact, if you look at someone who's incredibly wealthy, that should be a reason to think, wow, good on that person. He has provided an enormous amount of benefit to others. The thing that people will often say is that, oh, well, what if they didn't get the money that way, right? Like, what if they only got the money through some fraudulent means? Or what if they got the money through lobbying the government to get some special benefit? Although I suppose that's still fraudulent, same thing. But in any case, what if they got it through some untoward means? And in that case, I just simply say innocent until proven guilty, right? If you can actually show me that there's some piece of fraud that's resulted in someone's wealth, I'll join you in opposing that person. Or you can show me how this billionaire got that way by tinkering with government policies. Then yeah, I am against that. However, realistically, if you look at Jeff Bezos, what did he do? Right? Maybe he had some interactions with the government or something like that you don't like, but the vast majority of his wealth comes from simply the fact that he built a great service that lots of people use. So he's entitled to all of the wealth except that you can show me for a fact he got in some bad way. And again, innocent until proven guilty. The last thing is about the mega corporations specifically. Sometimes people will say that you wouldn't have these giant corporations in a truly free market, so they're bad in some way, like they must be propped up by government. In Hidden Order, David Friedman has this part where he talks about Adam Smith arguing that joint stock corporations were almost hopelessly incompetent and that they would never be able to succeed without government support. At this point, the joint stock corporation actually has more taxes applied to it than other kinds of organizations. And so it necessarily must be, in order to survive, not only a little bit more productive than alternatives, it must be much more productive to overcome that extra hurdle that the joint stock corporation has to clear in order to continue to operate. So it empirically just is not true that these large corporations, the joint stock model, wouldn't be successful outside of government influence. The government influence is opposing them, if anything, and they're still very successful.
Well, and it's helping some at the expense of others. So certainly Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, those are getting a lot of assistance from the Pentagon and from Congress. But others that are totally getting run out of town, if you just look at the Fortune 500 from 1960 to 2022, it's not the same companies. So according to leftist theory, that makes no sense. The biggest of the big should always keep getting bigger. But that's not what we see. When it comes to monopolies and diseconomies of scale, how can hidden order help us think about monopolies and diseconomies of scale?
Okay, so monopolies, it approaches in, I think, a much more sensible way than the hysterical way a lot of other mainstream textbooks tend to approach it, because it comes right out of the gate, tamping down the language a bit, right? So no company is truly a monopoly. If you sell blue cars, you're a monopoly, and you're the only one who sells blue cars. Are you now a monopoly? Well, maybe, but you're not a monopoly in cars. People may choose another kind of car except for other than yours. If you are not the only one who sells blue cars, then what about your specific shade of blue? Are you a monopoly over that? And the answer is that eventually, if you define the product narrowly enough, any company can be called a monopoly. And if you define it broadly enough, right, then no company is a monopoly, because like I might realize, this computer is a little bit too expensive. I won't buy it. And I then may therefore go and spend that money on several meals. So therefore, restaurants are competing with computers. And so a computer company that is the only computer seller is not a monopoly because it competes with restaurants. So it depends how broadly or narrowly you define the product as to whether something's a monopoly. So the useful way of thinking about it is price searchers and price takers, which is the way that many economics textbooks include, but David Friedman's one focuses on. The price searcher is just someone who has enough of a differentiation of their product from other products such that they can increase profits by reducing the quantity that they provide. They're trying to say, well, if I produce more, then I'm going to have to sell at a lower price to sell them all. And so I'm going to therefore produce fewer in order to maximize profit. Whereas a price taker is one which is doesn't have that kind of control, right? That if they sell above the market price, this is often the case for commodities. If they sell above the market price, then they're just not going to sell any because people will go somewhere else. If they sell below the market price, then they're just like leaving money on the table, and they're probably losing money in the process. So really, they just produce as much as they can and sell as much as they can. This is, like I said, often the case for commodities. Every firm is to some degree a price searcher and to some degree a price taker. So instead of using monopolies inherently as this idea of the big bad corporation that controls everything, let's look at the dynamic that the economic theory sort of refers to and use it to understand how firms function, right? Everyone's product is differentiated a bit, so you can search for a maximal profit within some bounds, and everyone's product does compete with other people's product at some degree, right? Like I say, to some degree, computers compete with restaurants. And therefore, you can use the normal economic theory where you just have to sell at a certain market price. So that's the way it deals with monopolies. It's much saner, in my view, than the hysterical way where you just say, oh, well, certain companies just can't be competed with. It's impossible. And they'll buy you out, which, I mean, why wouldn't I just make another company so you buy that out too? But all those sorts of things, those hysterical reasons that therefore we need the government to come in and fix this horrible problem.
When it comes to rent seeking, what does hidden order teach us about the economics of rent seeking?
Friedman's second law, the government cannot give anything away. So as long as it takes less than a certain amount of money to get the government to give you a certain favor, then there will always be some firms who are willing to enter the game. Like, I think the example he gives is, if it takes $1 million of advertising to get the government to give us certain grants to your firm, then it's worth it for you to spend up to that amount in order to actually get the government grant. And so by doing so, they're going to have to raise the amount that must be spent or lower the probability of success. And the equilibrium there gets reached when every firm, on average, spends as much to get the permit or to get the grant as it's worth, therefore bidding away all of the value of that government grant, right? So you'd be willing to spend as much as the government grant's worth in order to get it. Those companies who are bidding for that government grant are engaged in rent seeking. It's a situation where it really is a zero-sum game. Like, I spend a whole truckload of money in order to get some grant that thereby everyone else doesn't get. That grant was taxed away from other people. We're making it actually a negative-sum game. And because of that bidding war, even the company that wins doesn't actually get any net benefit out of it.
When it comes to subsidies, this is one where they say, look, government is this big, they got $4 trillion a year. Can't we have this really good thing called trade school. Let's just, give it to the trade school, and then everyone goes to the trade school for free. Because, they're cranking out welders. We need welders. We got to compete with the Chinese. Let's just subsidize the trade schools. How do you talk to that mindset who says, just subsidize it. Just write that. You don't even need to print the money. They just enter the digits into an account, send it over, and then we get all this free, more or less stuff.
Yeah. Well, the first thing you'd need to do is get them to think a little bit more carefully about what it means to just type in the digits, right? So if you're just typing in the digits, you're bidding away resources somewhere in the economy from someone else, right? There weren't suddenly created more people to do labor. There weren't more resources created or something like that by you typing those digits in. So you must be bidding it away from somewhere. So it's costing someone somehow. Who exactly is pretty complicated, and I think you get a good idea of it if you want to read Hidden Order. But you can still, at least at the outset, say that money's got to come from somewhere. If that is actually beneficial to go to those trade schools, then you should be able to advertise that fact, right? Advertise to people, hey, here's this really beneficial option that you have of these trade schools. I've got this trade school. I'm going to train you in order to get you this additional income. And if that doesn't work, you kind of might think that maybe these trade schools aren't as good as you thought. Personally, I think that there is probably some room to advertise such a product, but I could very well be wrong. Right? And the way you'd test that is actually trying to provide the service and see if it can turn a profit, not by getting the government to steal money from someone and put it into this purpose. Because if you just steal the money, you don't get that feedback. You don't know whether it was worthwhile. You just sort of tell yourself that it was, right? Yeah, it must have been. I'm sure of it. And you produce the trade school, but maybe it isn't a net benefit. You've got to put it through the test.
And I would just feel like such trash if everyone had to work out their issues voluntarily, but I just got a subsidy. Now, this is just an emotional argument, but I just feel like the guy at the party who helped create the mess, but just sat back and tweeted while everyone cleaned up the next day. Like, really? Are you not going to chip in? You're just wanting the subsidy. Notice the nature of the subsidy, how it changes who the customer is, therefore changing who the business or producer seeks to help out. So whenever I go to like a restaurant or even a private educational center like Kumon or a private tutor, they are really customer focused. They really care. Hey, what are we doing right? What can we change? When you go to state schools, when you go to universities, their customer is the state. So any shortcoming, yeah, but we need more funding. You guys got to vote for Mark Kelly again and Kirsten. Well, Kirsten Sinema's not progressive enough. We need to vote her out and get someone even more progressive in. So it changes the nature of the product too. So it's not just like, is everyone going to be educated or is no one? You're not getting the same education. You're also attracting different employees. So you're not attracting the most ambitious people who really care about this quality. You're attracting people who want to get paid by the piper of the state to promote the religion of statism. Just as if we arranged it for the Protestant church or the Catholic church or the Church of Scientology to have its own money printing machine, and then they could start employing academics. Well, of course, what line do you think they're going to toe if they want the pension? So you're hurting the people you're actually claiming to help by worsening the quality of this through this subsidy program.
I actually also know you can actually take a look empirically how this actually works out. So you can see the statistics that spending on public education, government education that we for some reason call public, just that's a whole other thing, that goes up and up and up, adjusting for inflation. It's not simply the case that the amount of money that the government spends on education is increasing, but that's inflated away. No, adjusting for inflation, the amount that the government spends on education goes up and up. However, the quality of education does not. And so you might wonder where all that money is going. And we know it's very clear because we have records on all of this. The number of administrators, additional people in the bureaucracy above those teachers has ballooned out of control. Corey DeAngelis has a lot of stuff that he links all the time on Twitter that talks about this. But there's a lot of really good research that all of the money, the additional money that you pour into these government institutions is going to go to additional bureaucracy because, like you said, it's no longer the customer, right? It's no longer the students and their parents who are the customers. It's now the state. So you might not be able to convince parents to send their kids to pay to send their kids to a terrible school with tons of bureaucracy above it. But you can absolutely talk to the government and say, oh yes, these 3 people who might also have been lobbyists of mine definitely need high-paying, do-nothing jobs in this giant bureaucracy. That they're definitely worth the money, and you might be able to convince the government of that.
And it's like none of these, whether it's the police union or the teachers union, they never thank you for all the taxes you pay. Hey, we really appreciate you guys paying property taxes on houses that you own, so I could have that. They're more entitled than ever, and they produce a terrible product. I mean, I hate that. Seems so cruel to look at the teachers and bash them when there's plenty of evil enemies out there. But for 12 years, do you feel like you're providing the service? Shouldn't we all be like these totally brilliant people? I wonder, is it because the more money they get, the more students they can have, and without raising their standards, all they're doing is having a lower common denominator with the more students that they have? So if I have 10 kids, I can really keep an eye on them. I can really pick and choose who I'm going to have, and I can have these high standards. But if I just indiscriminately in one large entrance bring in a ton of people, I'm okay. I can do 2 + 2. I can do easy addition. History is going to have to be Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. I can't really offend anyone. World War II gave Europe to Stalin. Let's just say we defeated evil. The evil Trump, the 1930s Trump. We defeated it. It's like all they have. It's so simple because they bring in all these people and don't have any standards. I'm sorry, we're going so long on this one, but
that's okay.
But I feel
now you're jumping into the credential inflation stuff. We could keep going on that.
Credential inflation. Yes, that's a great word for it. Giving everyone a college degree doesn't make everyone brilliant. It just ruins the credential.
Right, which is why you now have PhDs working as waiters.
One final thing I want to touch on the billionaires and mega corporations. What are the economic benefits, or why would it be morally justified for one person to own tons of property while other people might own very small amounts of property?
So the basic thing that Hidden Order gets into at first is surplus in transactions. So you'll have a consumer's surplus and you'll have a producer's surplus. In order for 2 people to voluntarily agree to a trade, they must both therefore be benefiting. So if I think that a sack of potatoes is worth $1 to me and it costs $1, I won't actually buy it. It'd have to be worth like $1.50 of worth of benefit to me, right? So therefore, it's worth it for me to make that transaction. And that doesn't have to be monetary benefit. We measure benefit in dollars, but we could measure it in anything else. The point, though, is that there must be some difference between what I'm paying to get this thing and the benefit that it nets me. So if that sack of potatoes is worth $1.50 and I pay $1 for it, I have 50 cents worth of net benefit. On the other side, the producer must also be benefiting as well. So the cost to him of producing and providing that sack of potatoes has to be less than $1, so he will benefit as well. When you have a situation where one person owns an enormous amount more than another person, that only happens because the person who owns more has provided more value for others. Again, with the exception of government and criminal enterprises, though I repeat myself. The situation in which you have two people who have voluntarily interacted, that tends to be just the norm on the private market. It's almost by definition what the private market is. And if you have someone who's an enormously wealthy billionaire, like we were talking about, that means he's provided an enormous amount of benefit. Now, usually the way that he'll do that, right, in our economy, the way that you'll actually get to that point where you're that much richer than other people is by providing some organizational structure. A little thought experiment that I like is, let's say that the staff at McDonald's right now, let's say that instead of working for that manager within the organizational structure of McDonald's, let's say that they just get together and the low-level staff, and they start their own burger place. I've got to be honest, the teenagers that work at McDonald's, I'm sure they're very nice, but I don't want to go to that burger place. Right? There is a large organizational structure which provides them food of a specific quality at a certain price, and has all of these plans for how the operation of the business should go. And so to every transaction that a McDonald's makes, that organizational structure is very important. So it's providing benefit on every single transaction that happens. Right? So that's a lot of benefit for the person who created that organizational structure to have provided. So why is it okay for one person to have much more wealth than the other person? Well, because everyone is getting richer in the process of that one guy getting really rich, right? We don't want to advocate that the poor become poorer and the rich become poorer just to make it more equal, right? I would much rather one person get richer enriching everyone else, even if it results in a lot of inequality.
Yeah, so we have this sort of inequality that exists in humans that is revealed through the market, not that it's created. Just as if you gave Jerry Seinfeld a pen and paper and me a pen and paper, we have the same factors of production, the pen and the paper. He would write something brilliantly hilarious, and I might make some doodle, or maybe come up with another person to interview who can use their intellect in place of mine. So two people having the same factors of production create totally different things. Well, how about me and Eminem have a microphone and a studio? Are we going to create the same thing? No. How about me and Pat Buchanan? If we both have a keyboard and access to the internet, he's going to write something brilliant, and I'm not at his level. So it's okay that some people have more power. And those are just single items. Imagine if you have whole factories. Who decides what to do with those? Where to market your products? Some people are better than others, and there's nothing evil or tyrannical about that. My final question here, even though I said the last one was final, that was a lie. What are your favorite everyday examples of people economizing in Hidden Order, the economics of everyday life?
Okay, so the everyday examples that I quite like. Let me give you two. So the first one are shoppers in a supermarket, and if a shopper is going up to the checkout, he'll take a look at the different lines, and we'll just assume that he usually goes to the shortest one, right? That's, I think, a reasonable assumption. Maybe not perfect. Maybe there's some friends in one of the lines he wants to chat to, but that's a generally good assumption about how people will choose a line. As that happens, you'll find that all of the lines will equalize in terms of the amount of time it's going to take you to go through them. And in the situation that one of the lines is moving faster or is much shorter, so it'll take you less time to get through it, people will be incentivized to go that line, thus increasing the duration of time that it'll take to go through that line, and thus equalizing them. The situation in which you will not take the same line that other people will take is when you have some additional information or some additional capacity to determine which line is going to get you out the fastest. Maybe the aisle you came out from your angle, oh, I can actually see this line over here, that they would be obscured to the people over there. So I'm going to go into this shorter line that some other people who came out later on, further down the line, might not have been able to see. So I have some additional advantage, which allows me to select a better line. So that's the situation in which I would be able to pick a better line. And the reason that I bring up that one is because of the next one. So that's a simple example, people economizing. It equalizes all the different lines. And if I have some specific advantage, right, compared to the other people, then I'm going to be able to do a better job finding a line, is doctors. So doctors get paid a lot of money, more than people who deliver packages, right? Probably, if you're watching this, good chance more than your job. Why didn't you pick being a doctor? You should, silly you, it pays more, therefore you should have done it. The actual answer is that no, all jobs in a certain sense can be expected to pay the same. Right? It costs more in order to become a doctor in time, in effort. And as well, it's maybe it's quite stressful. It will have some unpleasant things about it. It can be a bit yucky. Maybe you don't like that. There's a lot of things that are negative about doing that job. If it was really the case that being a doctor was just as easy or just as pleasant or just as cheap to get into as the other professions, then people would flood to that profession just like they flood to the shorter line, thus equalizing them. So the negatives and the positives should be expected to pretty much balance each other out. You, as a person trying to select a job, to better economize your resources, should find the thing that you have a comparative advantage in, right? It's like you're the guy who's come out earlier, right, or from a line closer to the start, and they can see an extra line that maybe is obscured. They have more information. They're better suited for finding the specific line. You should find the job not that pays the most, not that is the easiest in general, but the one where you have a comparative advantage. Like compared to other people, I'm quite good at this thing, or don't mind the disgusting part of this thing, or yeah. So that's the way that economizing works. And I like those examples because the first one shows very clearly economics ain't about money. Economics is about incentives and actions and things like that. Whereas the second one shows this is why we often apply it to things that do result in money or involve money, because it's a really important explanatory power and useful tool in deciding how to interact in the economy.
When it comes to looking at the economy and saying, look at all these jobs, all of this opportunity, there are some people who are just so poor, it's incredibly difficult for them to even get their foot in the door. If I want an economic system that gives the most people the most amount of opportunities, why should I look at this free market system that Hidden Order, the Economics of Everyday Life advocates?
There's a great quote from Andy Warhol, which is that the bum on the street. No, the president of the United States can't get a better Coca-Cola than the bum on the street. The things that people, the poorest, tend to do worst in are actually the government-provided services, right? Look at poor people's government schools. They are not great. Look at the way that police operate in poor neighborhoods, right? Compare that to the private market, where rich people and poor people alike get the same McDonald's, get the same Coca-Cola. There are definitely advantages to being wealthy, right? There needs to be in order for people to have an incentive to produce more. But the things where the poorest do the worst tend to be the government-provided services. So if you want the poor people to do as well as possible, it seems like the first thing should be to get the government out of everything.
Brian Kaplan, the behaviorist, as you corrected me, said free markets are awesome because they give businesses incentives to do good stuff that sounds bad. Governments are awful because they give politicians incentives to do bad stuff that sounds good. What are your thoughts on that quote?
Well, I definitely agree. The second one first, governments definitely have an incentive to do bad stuff that sounds good. This is something that I always touch on whenever I get the chance. When you're making a vote, when you're voting or you're taking any kind of political action that might be of interest to a politician, that it isn't actually going to net you the result that you have in your mind, right? Like, so you want a subsidy for your industry, or you want some handouts to the poor, or you want to fight a specific war, or you want to not fight a specific war. All of those things are things that you want, goals you have in your head, and you're trying to use your vote to influence the politician to take that action. The problem is that you as an individual have basically zero impact on whether the politician will actually do something different, and he has only a tiny impact on whether the government as a whole will do something different. So that means that you are rational in not really worrying about whether something will actually get the benefit, some vote you make or some political action, some argument on the internet about politics. You have no incentive to actually make sure that your actions are successful. The only thing you get out of voting or taking some political action is the feel-good part of it, right? You get to feel like, oh, I'm part of the good guys on the good team doing the good things, right? That's what you get for it. The problem is that there's a really easy way to get that. Fool yourself into thinking that some nice-sounding but wholly ineffective method of achieving that goal is perfectly valid and will absolutely work. Yeah, the way we solve people being poor is we just mandate that employers pay them more. Done. Problem solved. You have no reason to look into it to see if that'll actually work because you're just doing it for the feel-goods, right? That's all you need. So if something sounds good but won't actually work, it's still a very profitable thing for a politician to endorse. The opposite is true of a company, right? If you are selling a product and it doesn't work, it doesn't matter if it sounds really good in principle, people won't buy any after the first one doesn't work, or even after their friends tell them that it doesn't work. So even if it doesn't sound like it would work, right, you still have an incentive to do it, to demonstrate that it works, because every individual, if they buy your product, unlike their vote, they will have an 100% impact on what they get. I vote for a war, I don't get that war. I buy a pen, I get that pen.
Mm-hmm. There is really something that that people find sort of, I guess, repulsive about the concept of incentives. It's almost like treating people like objects. They think, but Thomas Sowell just pointed out so clearly in his work that the reason incentives matter is people usually put more effort into something that has an effect on them than they will not only someone else, but tons of people that they don't know that they're going to have a very small impact on. To which I say, every communist who disagrees with this says, we, the collective, will work just as hard individually for the collective as we would work for ourselves, even more so. A lot of them have houses and have never given me a house, and I think that alone might disprove their point, because certainly some of them should have houses for other people and no houses for themselves, but all of them keep doing it for themselves first. I can't some of these things I can't even explain without sounding like I'm talking to a child, but it's just so obvious that you choose to do with your time what you want, and that's why these incentives matter, something that the political process totally strips people of.
Yeah, when it comes, that's actually the thing. When you're talking about how some communist or socialist, he says that, oh, I'll just work just as hard for the collective. First of all, no, you won't. You do actually care about yourself more, as I think we discussed in our previous hangout together, our previous stream together. We were talking about reasons. One of the things we were talking about was reasons that you do things for yourself more than others, right? You definitely do a lot more for yourself on a daily basis than you do for someone else. But that aside, even if you just wholly care about other people, a political action is going to have a negligible impact on other people too, right? It's not really going to affect them at all anyway. You can think that, well, if we all did something, then things would change. If we all vote this way, but you are not us all, right? Even as an individual who only cares about others, you still won't make a choice in a political system that actually does benefit others. You'll still only take an action that is going to make you feel like you're benefiting others.
And that's why it's so important for them to find enemies. Like, I mean, I will say the right does this, with the Muslims. They'll do it with the immigrants. They'll do it with, well, the gays got married, and that's why all of these other things couldn't happen. But, I mean, seeing the left do it is just so bad because they have so much power with the woke corporations, with Hollywood, with K through 12 education, with the universities, not to mention the corporate press and everything else. So when they we're facing Trump, well, obviously we want to help people out, but this evil Hitler 2.0 is stopping us from doing it. And then they got the House, the Senate, and the executive branch, and now they're just like, the Proud Boys and the January, they're stopping us. We have no power in the face of Gavin McGinnis's group of friends. So watching them, so it's like, look, this whole thing of if only we have power, we the community are going to achieve this end. No, you're not. You have more power. You get $4 trillion every year and tons of regulatory and spying power. You're still not going for it. As far as non-everyday examples go, he uses large-scale examples such as someone economizes when they're on trial facing a judge and they take a plea agreement. Whether or not they did the crime, they're still economizing. When it comes to non-everyday examples, what was your favorite one in the book?
Oh, well, the trial one's a pretty good one. So with the trial example, the plea, the what is it called? Plea bargains. One of the things that he points out in the way people economize with regards to plea bargains, both on the side of the criminal and the DA, is that, well, people will usually criticize plea bargains, saying that, oh, well, it gives people lighter punishments than they really deserve, right? Because he wasn't convicted, he has this lighter punishment. But actually, if you really reason through the economics of the situation, it probably makes punishments more severe on average. And the reason is that it costs something to convict someone. So the example he gives is, say there's 100 cases per year. The DA's got a budget of 100 grand, just for the sake of argument. And so with $1,000 to spend prosecuting each case, half of the defendants will be acquitted. But he can get 90 defendants to cop pleas, and then the DA can concentrate his resources on the 10 who refuse. And therefore, he spends $10,000 on each case and gets a conviction rate of 90%. So plea bargains are likely to actually, once you reason through it, the way that people economize, the incentives they face, is actually likely to do the opposite thing that you might think. So I think that that's a really good example because it shows how economics leads to non-obvious conclusions that are nonetheless right. But I still think my favorite example of like a non-obvious use of economics is the evolution example. People will often think of economics, they'll think that it means you have to reason through stuff, but of course it doesn't, right? It just means we can assume some goals and predict your behavior based on the correct methods to achieve those goals. And the example that he uses, I think he says it's his favorite example, is sex ratios. So it's a weird thing that in so many species, it's half men and half women, or half birthing people. Sorry, no, I won't go there. So half men and half women.
Wait, hold on. We don't know what they identify as, so we just have to ask 7 billion people real quick. Yeah. We're going to pause the recording. Part 2 will be out in 2055.
Okay, but to be problematic for a moment, the half men and half women. The weird thing about that is that a man can impregnate lots of women, or at least a lot more than a woman can have children from a lot of men, right? So it seems like you'd get a higher birth rate. It would be a better sexual strategy to be a man, because then you can have a lot more children. But if you actually think through the incentives faced by evolution in this situation, if you start off with the opposite situation, right, that say 2/3 of the members of each generation are female, since in that case there are twice as many mothers and fathers, but each child has one of each, the average male must be having about twice as many children as the average female. And it follows that a couple with which has a son will on average have twice as many grandchildren as a couple that has a daughter. And so since couples who produce more sons have more descendants, more of the population is descended from them and has their genes, including the genes for producing males. And the genes for producing males increases in the population, and the process continues until the numbers of male and female offspring are equal. So what you just do there is you have a non-obvious conclusion, one that's obvious when you look around but wouldn't be obvious at the start, that has absolutely nothing to do with individuals' own rationality. It's more the rationality of their genes, right? And so that's probably my favorite example, because it shows that economics has nothing to do with money, right? That's just one of the things it can discuss. And B, economics doesn't even have to do with rationality in the sense of thinking things through to come to the correct conclusion. It just means we can predict your behavior based on a set of goals that you might have.
On page 25, he discusses prices. What is a price?
A price is how much you need to pay for something. Right? That's the definition of it. If you have to give up a certain amount to someone else in order for him to give you a thing, that's the price. It's the obvious definition, and I think it's the right one. That's what a price is. I think a lot of economists try to make this more complicated than it is. David Friedman does not. He will keep the simple and straightforward definition. A price is how much someone charges you for something.
He sort of expands on it. He says, why are diamonds, which most of us can get along quite well without, worth so much more than water, which is essential for life? How does Friedman get into the thinking behind the diamond water paradox?
So that's no longer about what a price is so much as it is about how prices are set, right? So basically what David Friedman would say is that, thinking about how in depth to get into this, but the diamond water paradox, it doesn't matter so much what the value of a diamond versus a bottle of water is. What matters is this diamond and this bottle of water. It's the marginal unit, the one that you're considering purchasing or not. Now, it's true that if you were on a desert island with no diamonds and no water, right, the water would be worth more to you. A bottle of water is going to be worth more to you than a diamond. However, we don't live on a desert island. We live in a world with tons and tons of people and tons of resources, and they're all trading these resources. So as a result, water, this is something that's provided an enormous amount of to pretty much everyone, right? Like at least in a modernized Western country where diamonds are actually more valuable than water, the water is provided in enormous quantities. And so whilst the first bottle of water is worth more to you than the first diamond, you don't have any diamonds, or maybe you have one. The second diamond is probably worth more to you than the 50th or 70th bottle of water that day. I mean, at some point you don't want any more water, and so the value of that next one is now lower than the diamond.
When it comes to price gouging, something that Chris Christie was very proud to stand hand in hand with Barack Obama with and say, we are taking on these price gougers. How can hidden order, the economics of everyday life, help us think about price gouging? So
price gouging is a sort of a dirty word for charging the market rate when the market rate goes up. Right? What you're doing is you're providing something that is really, really needed. And the reason we know that it's really, really needed by people, that it's really important to these people in this area, is that you can charge a lot and they'll still pay it. That means that there's now an enormous amount of profit to be gained providing that thing. So say there's somewhere where there's a drought. If you bring water to that area, you can make an enormous profit because people are willing to pay a lot. But what that means is that everyone realizes that, and everyone's going to want to bring water to that area. By restricting the amount you can charge for it, you take away the incentive to fix the drought by bringing more water there, right? So what you want is for people to be able to charge more when something's scarce, so that more people will enter the industry of providing this scarce resource, and thereby will bring down the price. So The price gouging is one of the things in the world that has the worst names, despite being one of the best things.
I know one of the great incentives to bring needed supplies to needed areas, where it's like the truck drivers are like, I'm not going, that's too dangerous. No, you're not going at the current price level. So you have to bid that up. Then your insurance might not cover you. Hey, we're not covering you if you choose to drive into that storm. Then there's even more liability. So the price goes up even more. It's just incredible how something like this has been vilified. Do you see this as one of the opportunities we could really communicate to people about maybe where they stand on an issue? So if I hear someone say, America's such a stupid country, they're the one country that doesn't guarantee health care to all their citizens. You can say, well, the state monopolizing something doesn't guarantee it. We have guaranteed court systems and guaranteed police, and we have guaranteed.
Which is why we have instant justice in every neighborhood.
We have guaranteed representation in Congress. That's why everyone's an anarcho-capitalist.
Yes.
So could we just say something like this? It's like, look, people tend to be self-interested. Therefore, if we live in a world of self-interested people, maybe even that's asking too much, but my question to them might be, do you want to have the incentive to pull people in and make them provide you with a good or service? Or do you want to basically have this political example where their biggest incentive is to maybe get a good reputation? I'm not sure. I feel like we're in the area of where we can really change the way people see this sort of economic incentive.
Potentially. I think that one of the largest problems is that we're up against incentives in this situation. Like, as I mentioned before, people don't actually have an incentive to come to good conclusions about what political solutions are actually viable, right? People don't have that incentive. So we are fighting an uphill battle here. But I think that one way you can raise the cost of having bad political beliefs is to create arguments that make you feel really stupid for believing stupid things. So I think that what you really want is something along the lines of, you want to explain in as few words as possible that when you reduce the incentives for providing stuff people want, or providing stuff that's really important, people will get less of that thing, right? And so, I'm against price gouging. You're against there being an incentive to get people more of a really important thing. That's what you're against, right? It needs to be as direct and as hard-hitting as possible.
How can hidden order, the economics of everyday life, help us think about subsidies?
So if I recall correctly, the example that David Friedman starts out with is potato subsidies. That's one of the first ones anyway. So he says that a potato subsidy will give us an incentive to eat more potatoes and make us worse off. So first of all, one of the good ways of thinking about it is to compare it to an alternative government policy, which would be just figuring out how much money the government was going to have to spend on these potato subsidies. Like, let's say it's $1 per sack of potatoes. Figure out how many sacks of potatoes you're likely to have to subsidize by that dollar, and then just give that money away. So here's why you'd be much better off just giving the money to people. And then I'll explain why you shouldn't do that either. So if you just give the money to people, right, they will sometimes buy potatoes, and they'll sometimes buy other things. As we talked about before, everything you buy because there's some consumer surplus, some difference between the value to you and the cost of buying it. If potatoes, if every single one of those dollars that the government gives you in that replacement for the potato subsidy, if every single one of those dollars you're going to spend on potatoes, then there's no difference to you. It's exactly the same. They may as well have subsidized the potatoes. However, if even one of those sacks of potatoes is less important to you than some other thing that you want or need or prefer, rather than the sack of potatoes, then the government's making you worse off. It's taking away the difference between the consumer surplus of that other thing and the consumer surplus of the sack of potatoes that you didn't want quite so much. So that's why it's better if they just give you the money. But then let's think about where they get that money from, right? They're taxing that money. So what you're essentially talking about is looking at this community, this society, taking a bunch of money away from them, and then handing it back in the form of vouchers for the exact same amount of money, idealistically, for the exact same amount of money, except they can only spend it on potatoes, right? What you're doing is you're destroying all of the value that they would have got, all of that value that was the difference between the value of the potatoes to them and the value of the products that they actually wanted instead of potatoes. All you've done is destroy that value. And once you come to that conclusion, the only real way back is to say, oh, right, but we're taking away from everyone and giving it back to specific people, right? We're subsidizing potatoes or handing out money to specific people, maybe the poor. Well, in that case, you're not arguing for a potato subsidy. You're just arguing for redistribution. You're just saying we should just steal from the rich and give to the poor, which is a totally different argument, right? And one that I'm interested in having as well. But at least be honest, right? That the potato subsidy was just a distraction. It was a waste of time and a waste of money.
That's how they pull you in, with a potato subsidy every time. It starts out with a potato subsidy, and then you're in Pol Pot's killing fields within minutes. What I should have said earlier was we need to break this down. Do you care more about the incentives or the intentions when it comes to things? Because you will literally hear them just talk about how good the alleged intentions are of these people. They don't even go to revealed choice preference. They don't even meet that small criteria. So the incentives versus intentions are so vitally important, especially if you think people are so evil. Like, if John D. Rockefeller and all these people are really evil, make it so they can't get a dime out of my pocket unless I choose to give it to them in exchange for a service. And that's why I think these conversations are so important. Toward the end of the book, he talks about political failure and market failure in chapter 20. What can we learn from market failure, one of the biggest justifications for state intervention?
So market failure is one of those things that sounds really obvious, right? David Friedman likens it to the theory of relativity in physics, right? People hear the theory of relativity and they think, oh, well, it means things are relative. I understand that. But actually, Einstein's theory of relativity that you're probably trying to refer to there means that there are very specific cases in which things are not relative, in which they are absolute, the speed of light specifically, right? So it's something that sounds to people like they understand it, like they will understand it. And so a lot of people think, oh, yeah, I get that, right? That makes sense to me. And they don't look into it and find out that the obvious meaning for it is actually completely wrong. Maybe that's a failure of the field, not being transparent and clear enough about what they mean, but it is a misunderstanding nonetheless. Market failure is kind of like that, right? Market failure is something that sounds like it just means, oh, well, it's when markets fail. I understand that. That makes sense to me. But that's not really what market failure means. That's not the important content of it. It might be a purpose to which the concept of market failure is put, but it is not the actual content that the idea of market failure actually has. Market failure is when individual rationality does not result in group rationality. Right? It's when, even if I, as an individual, do the correct thing to achieve my objectives, we as a group are still doing the wrong thing to achieve our objectives. And that sounds like a paradox, but it isn't. It's actually just a shitty situation. And the example that he gives, well, one of the many, is that it's 1,000 years ago, and you're in an army, you've got spears, and the cavalry is charging towards you with swords in hand, and if you all stand, then you have some reasonable chance of breaking their charge and surviving. If you all run, they'll chase you down, and you're all going to die. And so therefore, obviously, you should stand. No, that is actually wrong. You should not stand. What you should do is you should run. Your individual ability to break that charge is tiny, right? You're one of a giant army. If you run, that will barely affect the chances that the charge is broken. However, it will mean that if the charge is broken, right, you're miles away, so you're safe anyway. If the charge is not broken, you're the first one to run, so you have the highest chance of getting away. So no matter what, whether the charge is broken or not, you should you shouldn't stand and wait for the cavalry. You should get out of there. Everyone does that same calculation in their head, and everyone runs, and most of them die. And as David Friedman says, welcome to the dark side of rationality. Right, so that is a market failure. It is a situation in which individual rationality doesn't result in group rationality. And it probably sounds pretty familiar to what we've been talking about before, where your individual vote makes barely any difference. So market failure actually is not really the rule on the private market. It's kind of the exception. Like usually when everyone's trying to take action to make a profit on the stock market, as we described before, it actually does result in the stock market supporting the companies that provide good goods and services to people. Individual rationality does create group rationality. But on the political market, as he puts it, like with the government, your vote, once again, doesn't get you the policies that you're voting for. It gets you a negligible chance. It only gets you the feel goods. And so individual rationality, you're rational in that you're only voting for policies which sound good, does not result in group rationality, getting policies that sound good, right? So market failure, despite how it sounds, actually applies way more to the government than it does to the free market.
We see this all the time with politicians making tons of money and getting tons of fame off advocating totally ridiculous policies. I mean, Lindsey Graham's he's not like terrified he's going to go to jail for all the mass murder he supported overseas. AOC will even advocate policies that wreck New York and then go to Florida, be caught without a mask, and then literally tweet out, this place seems like, a lot of activism opportunities here. Might have to start talking to people like with zero self-awareness. This is an actual case of individual rationality not meeting group rationality, the military-industrial complex, people that benefit at the expense of others. So it's not just, it does sometimes occur in the free market. Certainly a polluter would be an example. Is there no pollution under government? If the state monopolizes everything, does pollution just go away?
Right. And actually, pollution is a really good example of why we need property rights and why market failure happens less when you do have property rights in a private market. The reason that pollution is a market failure is because no one owns, like, the river, right? So I'll pollute this river because no one owns it. No one's going to stop me. I don't own it. I don't benefit from the river. Right, the people who benefit from it don't own it. Right, they just benefit from it. However, if someone did own that, then they would have to. The people who want to use it for one purpose would have to pay for the ability to use it for that purpose. The people who want to use it for another purpose, like myself, who wants to pollute it for some reason, I want to pollute this river. I'm going to have to pay for the right to do that. So the reason that pollution is a market failure is specifically because there is not currently a private market in the things that are polluted. Right? So if you privatize that river, you immediately solve that market failure problem.
A lot of people will just look at inequality as something, when you're talking about income inequality, as just something so terrible, just inherently bad. Can't we just take from some and give to others? They couldn't possibly spend it all. I love what Hayek has to say about this. That's the only time you're ever going to hear me say that sentence, by the way. Hayek says in the Constitution of Liberty, our rapid economic advancement is in large part a result of inequality and is impossible without it. Progress at a fast rate cannot proceed on a uniform front, but must take place in an echelon fashion at any stage of the productive process of growing knowledge. There will always be many things we already know how to produce, but which are still too expensive to provide for more than a few. All of the conveniences of a comfortable home, of our means of transportation and communication, of entertainment and enjoyment, we could produce at first only in limited quantities. But it was in doing this that we gradually learned to make them or similar things at a much smaller outlay of resources, and thus began to supply them to the great majority. A large part of the expenditure of the rich, though not intended for that end, thus serves to defray experimentation with the new things that, as a result, can later be made available to the poor. Danny Duchamp, last comments on inequality with what we can learn from Hidden Order, The Economics of Everyday Life.
Hidden Order doesn't, it remains agnostic on moral principles like inequality. And I mean, it does also point out that it's plausible that a dollar is worth more to a poor man than a rich man, right? So that could be an argument that you could use against inequality. People should have more equal income for that reason. But again, it also echoes what Hayek said there. If you want people to be better off, if that's your more fundamental goal, and inequality is just a way of getting there, then the understanding of markets just seems to be a reason that doesn't work, right? As soon as you understand markets, you understand, okay, inequality is a hypothetical problem, right? It's something where, like, I can imagine that if we redistributed this wealth around such that it was more even, people might be better off on average in some sense because a dollar's worth more to a poor man than a rich man. And maybe that's the case. You can remain agnostic about it, but it's kind of irrelevant because the way that you produce all of that wealth, that you actually increase people's wealth overall, is necessarily going to create a lot of inequality. And as soon as you start to see equality in your society, you will also see complete degradation of living standards, right? The people who have gotten rich have gotten so by producing things for other people. If no one's getting rich and everyone's income's leveling out, then no one's producing all that much.
And that's not necessarily true always throughout history, which, as Jason Brennan points out. So he'll say things like, if someone was rich in feudal times or a mercantilist age, it's very possible that they only got wealthy at the expense of others. If you have a rich slave owner, it doesn't mean he provided value. Might be the opposite. He's just benefiting from the Fugitive Slave Act of 1790 or 1850. So when it comes to this this concept of the rich or bad, notice the complete imprecision with this is used. So Jeff Bezos, for all my criticisms of him, he has given me access to more books than I could have ever dreamed of. I would have to save up money, and then I could go to Barnes & Noble and buy one, maybe two. But he's given people like me at lower income levels access to all this knowledge that I never would have had access to, not because he just loves Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone in the Libertarian Institute. It's because it was his incentive to do so. Unless maybe he does. I can't rule that out as a possibility. Yeah. Give me final lessons from Hidden Order and other things I might have missed, your biggest takeaways, etc.
Yeah. So a lot of what we've been talking about so far has been just standard economics, really. So anyone who thinks, oh, well, I'm already well-versed in economics, is there anything actually new in this book that I'm going to learn? I have a couple of reasons that you should still read Hidden Order. The first one is that the arguments are just better. They're more succinct, much clearer. You will understand economics better. I've read a lot of different intro to economics books. This is by far the best one. I understand things that were very confusing to me before. However, there are actually some new things in it. The one that's really spoke to me is it's a little bit into the weeds, it's a little bit nerdy economic stuff, but there's a thing called Pareto efficiency. And that's the standard economics understanding of efficiency. An efficient system is one that can't be improved. An improvement in a Pareto improvement is a improvement that benefits at least one person and harms no one, right? So the common argument is that a voluntary trade is Pareto efficient, right? Because it benefits both people involved, right? Both people are now richer, and because they value what they got more than what they gave up, and there isn't anyone who's made worse off by that. Whereas if I steal something from you, that's not Pareto efficient. I'm better off, but you're not. So it's not Pareto efficient by definition. That's just what it means. When people are doing something like arguing against tariffs, which economists often do, they will switch to a definition of efficiency, which is called potential Pareto efficiency, as David Friedman calls it. In the literature, he doesn't mention this, but it's usually called Kaldor-Hicks efficiency. It's when some interaction benefits everyone and harms no one, except for people who could be compensated by the gainers for the losses. So if something harms me by $1, but harms two other people by $2 each, then you can say that that is a potential Pareto improvement, because if they both gave me 50 cents, then everyone's better off, right? We have that interaction, then they give me 50 cents, everyone's better off. The reason that economists, a lot of economists use that potential Pareto argument is that it sounds like you're avoiding interpersonal value comparison. It sounds like, oh, I'm not making a judgment about what's worth more to whom. I'm just doing Pareto efficiency, where we don't have to compare value interpersonally. We can just say, well, it benefits everyone and harms no one, so it must be an improvement by any definition of improvement. And the problem with Kaldor-Hicks improvements is that it kind of tries to sound like it's doing that, but it is actually comparing value interpersonally, just in a subtle way, because that interaction that you're trying to say is a Kaldor-Hicks improvement, that may not actually be associated with some side payments from the two people who gained to the person who lost. And in fact, the people who gained may not actually have been willing to do it with those side payments for a number of reasons. So you are actually still comparing value interpersonally. So what he does is he says, I would prefer to use Marshall efficiency. Alfred Marshall is probably the most influential economist in like the neoclassical school. And he simply said that, well, we're just going to forget about it, the difference between $1 to one man versus another. $1 is worth just as much to a rich man and a poor man in our reasoning. And for context, Marshall's justification for that was that when you're talking about large changes to the economy, it kind of averages out, because some of the benefits go to poor people and rich people and people who like this thing more and people who like this thing less. So it averages out. We can just treat $1 to one person as $1 to another person in order to analyze an improvement. So any economics nerds at least understood that. I hope that I explained it well enough for everyone to understand it. But at the very least, my point is that there are actually arguments in there and points in there that are useful even for people who are perfectly well versed in economics.
Help us fight big tech and sub to Danny Duchamp on Odyssey. Links will be in the description below. Danny, thank you for your time, brother.
Thank you.
My generation of Americans have been at war for 2 decades. We don't want war. We want peace. For Russia, for Ukraine, for Europe, and for the world.
And yet the war drums are beating and beating. So we have to be heard about this. This country does not need another war at all.
You see all the other countries that you're looking at. I mean, Syria, what do they got for a military? Iraq, what do they have for a military? So you think this is easy, and you think to yourself, hey, I think we go minimum 7 countries in 5 years. And that's when we run into a problem. Again, from my perspective, from like a free market scenario, this is now a monopoly. You know, you've got a monopoly here where people are just, hey, this is what we're going to do. And there's no counter to that on the free market saying, hey, that's not a great idea, but here's what we need to do. And then you even lose more of that free market because you've got the fervor of the American people.
You guys just saw it. Jocko Willink becomes an anarcho-capitalist. If it wasn't a monopoly, they would have, each and every one of them at the FBI, the CIA, and the Pentagon would have all, and the White House would have all been fired on September the 12th. We would have had to create an entire new security force to replace the one that backed these terrorists, turned them against us, and then failed to protect us from them. And instead, W. Bush got a 90% approval rating, because who else do you have? This is your security force. You're angry, aren't you? You want to hit back, don't you? Well, this is who you have to hit back with, is the same guys who didn't protect you in the first place.
Restraining aggressive behavior is one thing, but legalizing a government monopoly for initiating aggression can only lead to exhausting liberty associated with chaos, anger, and the breakdown of civil society.
I appreciate you coming out here and sharing your perspective.
Did I succeed in turning you into Ron Paul?
Well, I've always been a Ron Paul fan. So you didn't,
right.
that didn't take
That's
much
pretty
effort.
good.
That didn't take much effort.
All right.
I have come to one firm conviction after these many years of trying to figure out the plain truth of things. The best chance for achieving peace and prosperity for the maximum number of people worldwide is to pursue the cause of liberty. If you find this to be a worthwhile message, spread it throughout the land.